Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
Hello there, it's Zoe Routh. I'm your friendly neighborhood team navigator. I love to show leaders and teams how to explore the tough terrain of leadership. My question for you today is, look around you in your workplace. Is it a bit monochrome? Is it subject to a bit of groupthink? Could you benefit from a mosaic, a diverse bunch of perspectives and opinions and experiences? I say yes. And so does my amazing guest today. Her name is Olanike Ayomide-Mensah. She is the founder and CEO of Mosaic for Equity, and she is a workplace equity strategist. What does this mean? It means that she digs deeper into the layers of an organization to find out what is supporting and what is preventing people from diverse backgrounds accelerating and excelling in the workplace. So if you want to have a truly powerful, effective workplace that values all of its people, that gives everybody a fair crack, then she is the woman to listen to. I love this conversation. It is incredibly insightful, and it goes deep under the surface of what we typically see as prejudice, as marginalizing people, and actually tackles it from a systemic point of view. Very powerful stuff. Let's get into it. Well, this is a first all the way from Ghana, West Africa. Welcome to the show, Olanike Ayomide-Mensah.
Thank you, Zoe. I'm glad to be here.
We had a lot of trouble organizing time zones because Africa and Australia aren't that compatible. It's the end of your day and it's the beginning of the day here. So we've got all that to scramble. And yet we've made it work. So that's pretty thrilling. And especially so because this is such important work that you're doing. I would like to know, first of all, how you ended up in Ghana, West Africa, doing this work on a global scale around systemic equity. I mean, no one walks into that fresh off the streets. What's your journey to this place?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. I am Nigerian American, so my life story has sort of played out on both continents, in the United States and in Nigeria. I actually split my childhood between both places. I was born in the U.S., then we moved to Nigeria, then we moved back to the U.S. And so as a result of those, transcontinental moves and different events that happened in my family, I was just exposed to different cultures and subcultures and even different socioeconomic statuses and different faith practices. And so I just really, sometimes I refer to it as really existing or living at the intersection of difference. I found that happening a lot just in life. And so it just sort of naturally built a different way of looking at life. And I was also the child that didn't know how to be quiet, right? I was the child that didn't know that I was supposed to be seen and not heard, and got in a lot of trouble for that growing up, for asking too many questions and sticking my nose in adult business where it didn't belong. Because I just kind of had this lens that was developing over time and over my life, and also a different way of looking at challenges that were happening across difference, and this high curiosity. And all of that led to just a natural desire to always be part of the solution to whatever challenges were happening across difference in whatever spaces I was in. This started as early as high school. I took it with me to college, sort of advocating for people that I felt like were at the margins, and even in social settings. If I felt like someone was being not heard or not listened to, and if I happened to be someone with some influence in a circle of friends, then I would be intentional about reaching out to that person, calling them into the center, as it were. And this just kind of was a way that I went about life. And then when I entered the workforce, I realized that it was challenges across difference were also happening in the workplace, and they were rooted in systemic inequity, which we'll talk about some more as we go through this conversation. So naturally, as I'd always done in life, I was able to pick up on differences and things that were happening, see how other people might have viewed them as barriers, or whether consciously or not, see how different things were falling across lines of difference in the workplace and going, well, that's not fair. Why is that happening? That person is just as talented as that other person. There's no reason why that person should not have gotten that opportunity, or whatever the scenario might have been. And so I found myself raising my hand and volunteering for things that, just needed to be discussed. I found myself facilitating conversations about issues like that on top of whatever my actual job was. And eventually I realized, oh, people do this for a living. I can do this as my full-time job instead of being, I was sort of like on the CEO track, chief of staff type roles, talent development type roles, COO type roles was my track, whether when I was in the nonprofit NGO sector and when I was in corporate, like that was my lane. So I was always doing DEI stuff on the side, on all the councils, all the committees, all the ERG groups, all the things. And then eventually I was like, I want to do that with all of my working hours, because that's what I was doing anyway. And I do it in life, right? Because it's a part of how I just exist in the world. And so that's the story of how I got into this line of work.
Wow. Really fascinating. To go between two worlds that are so different, Nigeria and the US, is fascinating in itself. What stands out for you as the two clashing perspectives in those two nations?
You asked me about Ghana earlier, and it's interesting. My husband is Ghanaian. So being Nigerian and American and now living in Ghana, I've got all this data, right, about how inequity shows up in these different contexts. And what I've known for a while, and I'm seeing, again, I'm kind of, gathering more data here in Ghana, is that this is a people problem. Leveraging difference for gain is a humanity issue. It's a human problem. And it shows up in similar ways across, continents and countries and regions, but it can also show up very differently. But if you're paying attention, right, if you kind of put on a different set of binoculars, you can see that it's the same principles that are at play. It's just different players, right? So I may be in one context where, in an American context, for example, where the dominant folks, the dominant profile of the leadership or the executives are European Americans versus, Nigerian Americans or Black people or Latina people or whatever other demographic you may have. So you may have that in that context. But in a different context, in Ghana or Nigeria, for example, it's going to look different, right? If you go deep enough, there might be some racialized ethnicity differences in terms of who's in power and who's not. In many cases, there are people that have immigrated from other countries to a place like Ghana or Nigeria and are sort of benefiting from the history of colonialism and are really the power players in these West African countries, right? But at the same time, there is a lot of LGBTQ plus hate, right? That is still illegal here. You know what I'm saying? So like there's going to be different issues and dynamics. Here there's still a lot of sexism. just basic sexism is still a huge issue. And so it's going to look different, but the principles of people leveraging power for gain, the dominance and all those issues are some of the themes that you'll see in the different contexts. So it's an endless, I don't want to say meditation, but it's an endless brain exercise for me, being in all these pockets, culturally and in these countries, to kind of see how difference is just used to divide and conquer.
If I'm hearing you correctly, then a lot of the conversation is not necessarily race. The difference piece it's really like the meta conversation is about power, and how people exercise their power and use the narrative of difference, whether it's race or ethnicity or language or gender preference or a sexual preference, anything that is separate to the dominant power brokers, we can use that to subjugate others and maintain power. Have I heard that correctly in terms of your insights?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I gave a TEDx talk a couple of years ago and, talked about this narrative. Again, this is from a U.S. context of, the history of racism and how it's easy to just stop at people were evil and they don't like you or they didn't like us because of our skin color, right? Sometimes that's as far as the analysis goes. But when you look at the history and you look to the early beginnings of what became the United States, the development of race and racism in that context as we know it, it had a function. The function was people across racial groups that were in an oppressed state, right, that were laborers, were starting to unite and, fight the power, so to speak. Europeans that were there, Africans that were there, everybody, even the native indigenous people that were there were collectively saying something is off in this system. And they were working across race to topple the power system. And so you started to see decisions made across lines of race. There's a story that I tell sometimes in my workshops about three folks, what's the word? I'm losing the word in this moment. Three laborers, but there's a specific word. Indentured. Is it indentured? I'm drawing a complete blank. But anyway, they ran away from the plantation together. And when they were caught and brought back, the African was basically moved out of his indentured servitude, where the period of time that he was going to have to serve before he got his freedom was turned into lifetime servitude, aka slavery. But the other two who were European, just got like 3 years added on before they could get their freedom papers, right? So you started to see decisions, intentional definitions about who was Black and who was white started to enter the laws, right? So it was it was a choice. It was a tool to maintain power and to hoard power and wealth. And so when you look at it through that lens, yes, you might say it takes somebody evil to do that. So I'm not saying that evil wasn't part of the equation, right? But, I would like to see more of us talking about the function of power, the hoarding and of power in these conversations of equity, because that's when it gets real.
Well, thank you for sharing these insights, because it goes below the surface, right? So the visible manifestations of this are, they treat me different because I'm different to the main and they just don't like me. There's hatred. And I think your analysis going beneath the surface, looking at, well, it's about a human driver around power as opposed to it's a human driver around hate. I think that is actually more useful to work with. It's much more difficult to work around the ideas of hate, because that's a function of belief and perspective, whereas power is a more fundamental aspect of human development. I'm curious, have you read the book Revenge of Power, The End of Power?
No, I have not.
They're really good books. I've just recently read both of them. And it talks to the dynamics of power, obviously, since the title is about power. The Revenge of Power is about the rise of autocracy and autocrats and how they use autocratic principles to get into democratic institutions, subjugate them, and then hoard power. And it happens in white dominant countries as well as Black dominant countries. And so it's sort of looking at the parallels there about how people go about doing that. And one of the playbook tools that the author talks about is the use of polarization, which in another word is racism. We're good, they're wrong. Like, we're right, they're wrong. It could be religious fanaticism as well.
They're taking something away from us or from you, and you're like me, so I'm on your side, right, and they're the enemy, right? Like those narratives show up in different ways. Yeah. That's
right. Okay. So let's get to the heart of the issues and start to talk brass tactics. of how we can start to dismantle some of this stuff. So what is systemic equity as something that we're driving for? Because we clearly have systemic inequity in some parts.
True. Yeah, and if it's okay, I think I'll answer this. I could answer this big picture, society, the world, but I want to bring it down to the workplace, right? Because I think when we talk about people stuff and leadership, in a workplace setting, there's some examples that I think will resonate with folks. But systemic equity is when the systems within a workplace are proactively tended to, right? To make sure that those systems are not producing unequitable or unequal outcomes for the people groups in that environment. Sometimes when people, not me, people are doing DEI work, they focus only on, that hate part, right? Let's fix the people. Let's help you be kinder to your colleagues because we all bleed red and, all those things. And I don't mean to belittle that. That is important work. That heart work in this work is key, and that has to happen too. But what I like to focus on, my area of strength, is tackling the systemic elements in a workplace. What are the policies and the decision-making processes and the procedures that underpin a particular workplace and how people are treated as they're trying to get hired, as they experience your workplace as an employee, as they exit, how are people being treated? And once you start looking at what your systems, your HR or people system is producing, and you start looking at those outcomes across lines of difference, the numbers, and the qualitative and quantitative data will tell you some things about what's playing out systemically in your workplace, right? So what we try to do when we do assessments is to look at your processes, your policies, decision-making, power, how information is shared or hoarded, all of these things. We also look at how people feel. So we do focus on the heart part in addition and figure out, do people feel like they belong here? And there's a series of questions and a framework that we use for that. And then with that full picture, and conversations and focus groups and things like that, we can start to see what is happening in a particular workplace and systemically what you can do to try to get your workplace closer to equity, right? To having an equitable system that is operating in the background of your workplace. And so when you do that work, in addition to hard work, right? The hard work and equipping people to be able to do the things you're asking them to do and lead and manage people in the way that you want them to is really important. But people come and go in an organization, right? They're not going to be with you especially now, someone stays with you for 5 years. It's like a miracle these days. It didn't used to be that way, right? So when they leave, if all you've done is hard work, well, then you haven't really done DEI work in a sustainable way because it's not embedded in your system, right? So you had a great manager, you had a great leader, you had a great CEO or a great, chief executive officer in charge of HR or DEI or whatever, and your policies, your practices, your systems, your tools, none of that changed. It was all anchored around people, and then people leave and you're not able to sustain the work that you were doing. So systemic equity for me is really getting to the point where your system is producing more equitable results, right? Where you don't have a scenario where it is consistently predictable that, a particular, identity profile is going to be in leadership or making the most money in a particular place or having the most, influence or power, right? If I can, and I've been in places like this as an employee, but if I can pretty much guess, because of the history and what's happened, while I've been paying attention, that in a workplace, the top leaders are always going to be women or are always going to be men or are always going to be of a particular faith practice or always whatever, then that's not happening by accident. Something is happening in your system, even if it's not conscious, that is leading to that result, right? Sometimes it is conscious. That's a different conversation. But a lot of times we're just like, well, they're just the best talent. So are you saying that non-white people or non-Black people or, women or men or whoever is missing and not present, that there's no talent in that demographic of human being? That can't be true. that can't be right. So then we can dig into what's happening and try to address it.
I love this. This is fabulous. I want to know, so just digging into some of this, right? So you've done the assessment, looking at process, policies, power, information sharing, and feelings across an organization, and found that, well, the visible outcomes, the qualitative and quantitative ones, are the people at the top and decision-making powers are uniform in whatever way. How do we then look at the system, let's say an HR process? What's our recruitment system like? What are some examples of things that surface when we look at like a recruitment system, say, for example, that alienates one group over another or selects one group over another? Can you give an example of that?
Yeah. In looking at recruitment, I actually teach that there are 8 steps in a hiring process. Usually when I ask people, like, tell me the steps in your hiring process, they might give me 3 or 4. And I'm like, there are 8 steps in your hiring process. I'm not going to rattle them off right now, but if you want them, there's a freebie on my website that tells you what they are. But what I do is teach people to then isolate those 8 steps and think about what are the processes, procedures, decision-making that is happening in those 8 steps. What are the tools that you're using? So the typical steps that people will go to is maybe the job posting or the job description and the language that's used in them. There's a lot of data that's coming out about language that actually will turn off certain people, across sort of gender identity lines. And that's really fascinating stuff. And there's also a greater push for salary transparency on job posts, which also has equity implications. So when you look at that data, you're able to see, it's interesting. This has happened to me. I was in a workplace. We looked at our hiring process data, and we could see at certain drop-off points, like, well, that's interesting. A lot of Latinx people are dropping off, or a lot of Black people are dropping off at this point. They're kind of with us. They're applying to the job initially at pretty equitable rates, across these racial groups. But then when we get to maybe after the first phone screen, all of a sudden we start to see more of this profile represented in the candidate pool than other profiles. And so we gathered the data, we started to look at it, and it was shocking, because we would have never guessed what we saw if you had asked us to just think about the process and what was happening. So we could then say, okay, if this particular profile isn't even applying for the job at all, what is it that is missing here? Are we not engaging folks in that community? Do we not have relationships where folks from that community are even able to know that we're hiring? What is the block? Why aren't we getting folks like that to apply? If you are seeing a drop off maybe at your phone screen stage, well, who's doing your phone screens? Are they trained to do a phone? A lot of times people are doing interviews that haven't been trained on how to interview, and everybody's not a good interviewer. So we just go hire, somebody and hire them like 3 weeks ago because we needed them a month ago. And people are just, overworked and stressed out, and they want to get somebody in the door, and they're not trained, and they don't have competencies or a structured interview process to go with. And so they're screening candidates, and all our natural human bias comes into play, and then we make decisions and we see a difference, right, in who was engaged in the process and who's engaged after. So that was one of the things that we worked at, is really standardizing our interview process and our interview questions and the way that we assess candidates, so that everybody's looking for the same characteristics, and we're trained on what these words mean. What does a team player mean in our context? Exactly. What kind of behaviors would you be able to gather from an interview question that would tell you if this person is a team player? So that's a lot of upfront work to address that piece of your system to produce more equitable results in the end, so that you're not always getting the same kind of person at the end of your process and then going, well, we posted a job description, anybody could have applied, and, kind of throwing your hands up.
That's a big one. It's like, the women, like, I hear this a lot. Oh, women don't put themselves forward for job candidacies at a less rate than men. And it's like, well, let's fix the women. Like, let's make them more confident and whatever. So as an example of how we do a systems change there, which is less about like trying to boost up the women and more about what is it about, like if we were to tease apart that piece, like there's a deficit in the candidate pool, how might we go about tackling that?
It would probably depend on what the workplace, not probably, it would depend on the context, right? What's the workplace? What are the kinds of roles that you're hiring for? I would look at things like the job description and all of that and the way that you scope the role. But I think that, let me see, I was in a conversation with a client recently about this. And they essentially were asking questions in their interviews to try to understand who the person is as a person. But these were questions that were dangerously falling into the line of questions that are actually illegal to ask in an interview setting in the United States. For example, you cannot ask a woman, right, or a child, bearing a birthing person in the United States whether or not they intend to have children, or start asking about how many children they have, because the history of working in that place says that that's an area where women and birthing people have been discriminated against. So that then, because once you realize that this person is starting a family, they want to have more children, and you might see that as just small talk. I'm just getting to know them as a person. But then when you go back with your colleagues and you're assessing whether or not you should hire that woman versus, the male person that's not going to be having, that's done building their family or whatever it might be, that's a data point for somebody who's thinking, yeah, I don't want them to have to go out on leave, for however long, right? I need them to be here working. So let's not, right? So the value in having a structured, first of all, taking the time to assess your context and where are the issues that are happening so that you're not just throwing darts at the wall blindly or just, and spending money on things that are not going to get you anywhere. There's a lot of value in taking the time to actually assess the problem. And I also find that a lot of people don't invest in just the time to correctly, accurately assess the issues and the challenges and prioritize them so that you can move forward with confidence and clarity on exactly what you're working on. So that's important. So in a situation where women are not being hired or not being advanced, I would say, first of all, make sure you take the time to complete thorough assessments to understand that. And then, you might find in that example that I just gave that they don't have a structured interview process, right? That is a big red flag, just off top. You're not asking the same candidates the same questions. You don't have a structured way of deciding if they meet the criteria for the job or not. And so you may find that that's where people's bias is coming into play and sort of dictating what those decisions end up being.
I suspect also that a lot of the talent tracking programs are a place in the ecosystem of a business where there are some systemic challenges. And I think about that too. Like, how do we identify high potential talent and how do we then encourage them? And I think that's kind of mushy for a lot of organizations. It's like, Jeffrey looks like he's always speaking up. He looks confident. He reports well. Clearly, we should pluck him to move forward. Or George is kicking goals and all across his KPIs. Let's work on him. Let's put him in the talent pool. And we're not looking at whether it's other women or other men or people who are different to the norm of that organization. And we're not nurturing all of them. So I think that's a really interesting point. It's like, how do we identify talent as a contribution to systemic equity?
I really love this. I talk about this in my online course. And we actually have a portion of our survey where we ask about how nurtured people feel. Like, that is a component of if people feel like they belong, and a component of if they're going to be advanced or not, if they feel like they're professionally nurtured in a workplace. And that is something that an HR director cannot do. Your manager, who's working with you day to day, is the one that has the most influence on how nurtured you feel professionally. Of course, the whole workplace can be set up to better help support your manager and support you. But anyway, I digress. Identifying talent. I think that sometimes we use that word and we don't actually all mean the same thing. So defining what we actually mean by talent is super important. I'm a big fan of competencies in a workplace. So investing some work up front to decide what are the skills, the specific skills and competencies that we need everybody that works here to have, and what are the ones that we need people in certain divisions or functions or certain leadership roles to have. And what does that look like, right? And usually when I'm working in the weeds like that of developing, a new process or definitions or what have you, I ask people to think about all the demographic groups we can come up with, right? All the racial groups and ethnicity groups and gender and people that practice different faiths and people that have different family statuses and veterans and folks that are neurodivergent. And so when we're answering this question about this competency, I want you to think about all of these different ways that people show up in the world and think about what might this competency or this behavior look like in someone that maybe you're not used to. So you may think that confidence is looking me straight in the eye, but in a different cultural context, looking people straight in the eye is actually rude or disrespectful. And so if you come across someone that doesn't look you in the eye and you think, well, they're not confident, they're not going to be able to do this job, without some deeper understanding of maybe they show confidence in a different way, right? You're going to discount someone that might be just the person that you need to hire and to help you to hire into a role. So identifying talent is one of those things that I feel like there needs to be clarity up front about what we mean by talent. And then we also need to know, as the decision makers, the power brokers in a particular workplace, that those competences and those skills can show up in different ways than we're used to. And how do we make sure that we're not losing out on talent as we've defined it just because we can't recognize it, because it doesn't look like how we're used to it looking.
That's really, really helpful. I think it also speaks to the same conversation of identifying high potential leaders. What does that mean, actually? And because that's like a predictive into the future thing, who is likely to be a high performer? And if I'm hearing you correctly in terms of what you're suggesting is, let's not look at the end point, let's look at the current point and how do we develop, rather than high potential, how do we develop high competency across the board? Is that how you would respond to the high potential issue?
I would, because here's what I have experienced multiple times. And now I get to gather data from working with different clients and people inside of workplaces. And so I'm gathering even more data, but it's consistent. If you're in a workplace where there's a clear dominance, right, of a particular profile of people that are in leadership or that are in power in that place, you're going to have this high potential decision point or decisions about who is high potential and who is not play out in really inequitable ways. Because again, you don't recognize potential in people that you are not in community with. If you're not versed, either through relational connection with others, there are others that are unlike you. If you haven't been in a lot of multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic settings where you've seen certain behaviors or whatever you would call as an indicator of a high potential person across these different yeah old lingo. If you're not used to that, then you don't know how to pick up on it, right? So you're gonna pick up on people that are most like you or people that you've been exposed to, because that's what you can recognize that, and it's easy, and so you do what you know, right? And what has happened, in a workplace setting is people that are actually skilled and actually talented and actually already in many cases doing the role that they're applying for get looked over, right? Consistently. They don't get the advancement. They don't get the stretch opportunities. They don't get the, invitation to do something that's going to give them some high visibility to be able to really shine, so that the leaders, when they're talking, 6 months from now, are like, oh, no, they were great, because they had an opportunity to see them in action, right? So a lot of high potential people do not get the opportunity and get passed over. And so it's a difficult one. A lot of people of color are already doing the job that they're trying to get hired for, get promoted into, and still will be passed over for someone else who's considered high potential and hasn't even done the job, right? That the other person is already doing, just because of the inability of the decision maker to see and to honor the talent that is in front of them, right in front of them sometimes.
Olanike, this is a really important conversation about can't see. The can't seeing part is really interesting. I was talking to a business owner and I was asking him about, how is your diversity in your organization? Is a traditionally male dominated organization? And he was like, "Well, we're really good at it. We're really inclusive. We really encourage diversity in our workplace." I'm like, "Have you looked at your senior leadership webpage?" I said, "There is not a single woman there. It is every single one. There's about 16 profile pictures. They're all men, and there's 2 of color." And he went, "Oh my God." He said, "Really? There's no women there?" I'm like, "No." And he's like, "Wow, didn't see it," because I guess this is what I'm checking with you. We can't see difference because we look for what's familiar, and what's familiar looks like us. Is that one of the root causes of why we don't see other people? Or we just look for the things that look like us?
It can be conscious, but I don't even think it's conscious for folks, right? We sort of are a product of our socialization. So we are socialized from birth, just in whatever context, whatever setting, we are, or society we're raised in. But then we also get socialized as professionals, like in a workplace, to identify or sort of have proxies for decision making. So we have things that we look for, that we learn to look for, that tells us that somebody is competent in XYZ. We have proxy things that we look for that are the indicators that help us feel confident that this person can do this role, or they can be a great manager, or they can move into a leadership role, or head up a division, or take on that special project. And so, there's a level of humility that is called for when you're trying to do equity work, truly do equity work, to know that, yes, I've been socialized. Yes, I'm biased. Everybody is. I am a biased and socialized human being, just like everyone else is. Otherwise, you're a robot. You're not human if you're not biased. It's impossible. And to have some humility to know that you don't know everything. You're not all knowing. You haven't seen all the things that there is to see about all the people in the world. And so, yeah, we can't see the things that we haven't been exposed to, that we haven't been socialized to understand, behavior that we haven't been socialized or exposed to understand, that is a different way that leadership can show up. That is a different way, and it can still be effective, even though it's different, even though you're not used to it. And that is a global issue. Again, the players might be different, but that is definitely a global issue, not being able to see. And that's where some of that workshop and training and coaching can be helpful. There's been some focus, and it's dwindling, I think, in the last couple of years in workplaces globally, to really think about inequity across the board. And that's great. I think that is important, in addition to the systemic issues that I advocate tackling in a workplace setting. But that being able to see part of the equation, it really takes an investment from the individuals, right? To understand, to have that humility that I don't know the things that I don't know. And if I get, confronted with a detail or a challenge to an assumption that I'm making that I think is fact, how do I respond in that moment? Understanding that I don't know everything. How do I give that, challenge some room to see that maybe that is an area where I have blinders on and I don't understand something, and I don't understand that they're telling me that this person can be a great leader, and I don't see it because I've never been in community with a leader that looks like this or acts like this, but they have, right? So there's some internal mindset shift work that has to happen when you're doing doing this work in earnest, because no matter who you are, you're going to face that moment. Even if you're someone from a marginalized identity group, you're going to face that moment where you're challenged by something you haven't seen before, or someone that shows up in a way that is opposite from what your assumptions might have been, what your biases might be.
That's fantastic. Olanike, this has been rich conversation. There's more to talk about, I'm sure. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Oh, so my website is the number one place. Whatever I do elsewhere is going to be housed somewhere on my website. The website address is www.mosaic4equity.com. And if I may, I want to say a little bit about that. My belief is that our differences actually make us richer. Not in a financial sense, even though there are the studies that tell us that. But, I really believe in living and working with a mosaic of people. And so that was the origin behind the name Mosaic. And we really do anchor our work on equity, right? We talked about power. I'm not trying to put new people in the position of the power brokers and the oppressors or whatever. Like, I'm not trying to flip this paradigm. I'm trying to create a new paradigm where we are all equal, truly, where there's equitable outcomes for all of us. So that's the story behind the Mosaic for Equity. So you can find me there. I have some resources on my page. I mentioned a freebie earlier that I hope people will go check out on questions to ask when you're looking at tinkering one or all of the 8 steps in your hiring process. So I hope you check that out while you're there. I'm also really active on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. I play on Instagram, but I'm on there. I just kind of hang out and share funny things and, sometimes serious things and memes and things like that. So I'm on Instagram too at Mosaic for Equity. Anywhere you are, if you type in hashtag Mosaic for Equity, if I'm there, I will come up because we use that hashtag on posts about our work. So yeah, that's where to find me. I'm really excited about an online course that's launching soon, and it's about everything that we talked about today. So if you're curious about something that I said, you want to dig in a little bit deeper, please go to the website. The course is linked there. It's mosaicforequity.com/course if you want to go straight to the page about the course. And it's called Disrupting Workplace Inequity. And I walk you through frameworks and strategies that you can use to build your own strategy to embed equity into your system so that it doesn't walk out of your workplace with people when they retire or leave or quit or whatever, or to get laid off, which is another way that people are fired, which is another way people exit, right? So I hope that people will check that out. We have a really, really good promo deal. It's basically half off for the first date that's coming up in October 24th. So it's a good time. These deals will not stay. So
no worries. We will put links to all that in the show notes so that people can go straight through after they finish listening and click on through to check out your programs. I love the work that you're doing. This has been an incredible conversation. It's been a privilege to meet you and spend time with you. Thank you for staying up late. I really do appreciate it. And I look forward to sharing your work and your insights with the world so we can change the world and make it a better place for all of us.
Yes, I love that. Thank you for having me.
Wowie, that was fun. I really wanted to keep talking about this topic. There's so much to understand and to pick apart. How do we get a more equitable workplace? How do we encourage people to live into their potential, all of our people? For me, the biggest takeaways are the affiliation of the idea of dominance and power and using difference, whatever the difference is, to the dominant grouping as a way to wield and consolidate and hang on to power. So I think that was pretty powerful. What else? Just digging into the nitty-gritty of our systems and analyzing where we go wrong in our systems in terms of encouraging equitable opportunities and development in the workplace. That was all really amazing. So a few announcements to point you to move forward in your professional leadership development journey. We've got an event coming up called 3 Ways to Get Your Team to Think More Strategically. There is an online webinar on the 13th of October, and there is a breakfast event on the 14th of October in Canberra. Both events are free, and the links will be listed in the show notes. Or you can go to my website, zoerouth.com, click on programs, click on events, and then the registration page will be there for you. We've also got Olanike's course coming up in October as well. The link will be on her website as well as in our show notes. And The Olympus Project, my brand new debut novel, is available on my website to buy hard copies that are personally signed by me. The collector's edition is out right now. If you are keen to wait for the ebook or want to get it distributed from Amazon, the launch for that will be November 20th. So this is your chance to get a personally autographed, signed copy of the collector's edition. Right now, it's on our website. Just click on books and The Olympus Project is right there, and it is waiting for you. I can't wait to get it into your hands. All right. Well, that's all from me right now. I hope you're enjoying your neck of the woods, your time of day, doing whatever activity you're doing while listening to the show. I do appreciate your listenership, and I hope it brings you value and encourages you to step into your power and to be the powerful leader that we need you to be. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.